Hello everyone, welcome back into the studio for part 2 in our series on waste molding. This part we're going to open the molds, which is essentially carving the plaster molds off of our castings, not really opening. Now let's move on to carving the nose. The cast of the nose inside the mold is made of plaster, and it's the same plaster that we used to make the mold, so this might end up being a little bit trickier than the eye. I was quite nervous before beginning this, even though the shape of this casting should be easier to carve out compared to the complex surface topography of the eye. The casting itself should certainly be more fragile though, since it's made out of plaster, but even the resin did get chipped while carving, so we're going to start the very same way here by getting rid of the edges. The flange that extends out from the casting itself is a good place to start, and by getting rid of this we also help rock some of the plaster along the edges a little loose in the process. Since I know the flange extends outside the casting itself, and I can of course see that by observing the mold from below, I can carve this flange off without seeing the inside of the mold. As long as I just knock off the flange, I know I won't hit the casting itself. From there, we're going to rip the burlap layers off this piece, and that's going to get rid of more of the plaster layers. However, this burlap was embedded in the final layer of plaster that we added, which in retrospect of course means it will only remove the final layer, and I'll still need to carve through 3 layers of plaster, which is almost the same that I had to do with the eye. So for this burlap trick to be really useful, you need to embed the burlap into the second or third layer of plaster that you apply when making the mold. In this way, when you rip the burlap off, you're ripping off multiple layers of plaster, making the carving work much easier since so many layers are gotten rid of using the burlap, or by ripping the burlap. From here, it's all about carving slowly again. One thing that I noticed is that the plaster mold seemed to come off the plaster casting much easier than it came off the acrylic resin casting. There might be multiple reasons for this, of course. Perhaps I was able to release the nose better using the Murphy's oil soap than releasing the eye, meaning I applied the release agent better and more thoroughly on the nose than I did on the eye. Perhaps there is something chemically going on which helps the plaster separate from itself more than it does from resin. Or perhaps the plaster is just less sticky, and therefore the casting and the mold doesn't bond to each other in the same way as if the casting is resin. I do happen to know, through experience, that acrylic resin, or that the acrylic resin that I use, which is called hydro resin, sticks to everything insanely well. Which is a great feature when making molds or castings, for example. But perhaps not such a good feature if you'd like to make sure the resin separates with little effort from the plaster while making a waste mold. A huge thing to consider here is making sure that the plaster of the mold is dry before the casting is made inside of it. This will really help limit the amount the plaster casting can stick to the plaster mold. Plaster sticks better to itself when it's still moist, so an older and drier mold is going to release much better from a casting than if you turned around and made the casting the very same day the mold was made, for example. We've had students make these waste molds during our casting week before, and sometimes they've struggled because of the time crunch that they're in. They only have a week to do this, and this sometimes means that they don't always give the mold enough time to dry. It could also be the way they mix the plaster, of course, which makes it not dry, and it could also have been the atmospheric conditions. The winters here in Florence are very humid and wet, and so you'll have to wait a bit longer for your mold to dry before making the casting. It's also going to be a good idea to make sure the casting itself is allowed a few days to dry so that it's hard when you carve. If you've ever dealt with plaster that's set up recently, you'll know that it doesn't feel very hard, but more like a cold wet cookie in a way. It can almost get smushed or crumble between your fingers, and if you wanted, you could, or at least it feels like you could, rub the surface of a plaster casting that's fresh and essentially smooth it out. Impact the look of it, rubbing it smooth almost. Once the plaster is a bit drier, it's much more stable and easy to handle without damaging it, and that's of course important here, when we're not only handling it, but straight up almost carving into it in some cases. This casting was allowed to sit over a weekend, and I think this meant that it was dry enough to where it didn't cause any problems for us at all. The mold was also even older than that, of course. Carving a wet mold becomes more like smushing the mold in a way. It doesn't want to chip off and break apart because it's more like a wet cookie compared to a dry cookie, if you will. And this makes carving the mold off the casting almost impossible, or at least one of the worst jobs you can imagine. If you are in a place where the humidity is very high, try to leave the mold in a heated room or in an air-conditioned room so the moisture can evaporate from the plaster. Do this between every step where you do use plaster, and you should be okay. The plaster, by the way, shouldn't feel cold and wet to the touch. If it does, you should probably let it dry a little bit more if you can. If you pay close attention while this is being carved, you'll see that in some areas the colored layer of plaster actually shows up a bit more easily here. It was very inconsistent in where it showed up, however, which made it somewhat useless. So more color for this layer is certainly going to be needed for this trick to work. Because I managed to free up some larger chunks along the edges here, it made it much easier to carve and visualize. The edges function as depth markers almost, gauges for how far I need to carve. Even if the colored layer would have showed up more and have been more helpful, I think using the edges and areas where you have carved to the surface to your advantage is a very important thing. It makes life a lot easier if you know exactly where you need to carve and how much you can take off. If you don't, you're guessing and having to go much slower. Working along the longer flat side edges of this nose was useful and much easier than, for example, trying to carve one of the corners, where it's much more of a risk of you hitting that corner and therefore chipping it. By carving along those flat edges first, you're going to free up those corners anyways. Strategy seems to be important here, as some places are just simply going to be easier to carve and allow you to circumvent a lot of very difficult carving. Every piece is of course going to be different, but I do suggest trying to deeply consider this while working. Working a bit everywhere in the beginning and discovering where on your piece it's going to be an easy time and where it's going to be a hard time in terms of carving is useful. Carve the easier areas first, as in some cases, these easy areas, will release the more difficult areas by default, allowing you not to carve them at all. The tip of the nose along the bridge of the nose and inside the nostrils are very hard areas to carve here, but by carving the edges of the piece first and thinning out the layers around these harder to carve areas, you're going to see those harder areas chip off very easily by simply hitting them a bit with the back of the hammer. This means I'm never even carving down to the surface here, and the plaster comes off in these nice big chunks. Once it gets thin enough, and the easy areas have been carved off, you can almost use your fingers to push the plaster off the casting in some areas. I think the nose came out a bit nicer. It probably was a nicer sculpture overall, and that's why. This video ended up being much shorter than our normal videos, of course, but I wanted to make it to conclude this little series on making waste molds that we have. As I mentioned at the top of the video, there will be another video this month as well, coming very soon, and it's a first at that. We've never covered what we're about to cover in this video. We're going to cover some drawing basics, which I'm quite excited about and some of you have asked for, so stay tuned for that. For now though, thank you for watching until the end of the video. I hope you learned a thing or two that you can take with you into your own practice. Please let me know what you thought about the video in the comments below. Until next time, Stay creative.